Welcome to Sociology 102, Police Violence, Black Lives Matter, and the COVID-19 Pandemic. I'm your instructor, Professor Wary, and today we're talking about genetics, race, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm joined by my colleague, Professor Dalton Conley. He's here in the Princeton Sociology Department, and he happens to hold a PhD in biology as well as a PhD in sociology, so it's a real treat to have you with us today. Yeah.
Thanks for having me, Fred. Excited to be here.
Yeah, this is gonna be good. This is gonna be really good. So, growing up, we all learned about natural selection and human evolution leading to group differences. So what do people get wrong when they talk about natural selection?
Well, I think there's a bunch of things that people get wrong. One is that people tend to think of natural selection as directional, that there's some end goal that biology or nature knows about and is trying to get to that goal. Like people are better off if they're taller, and so natural selection is directed towards that goal of being taller and taller, or smarter and smarter, or living longer and longer. Ultimately, the only sort of direction that selection goes for is to maximize the number of surviving offspring and your own chance of survival. All other traits that seem to be under selection or under other genetic influence, like genetic drift, are just along for the ride, really, in terms of selection. And selection doesn't always or even usually act in a single direction. There's a concept called stabilizing selection that suggests that you want to be in the middle of a distribution of some trait to maximize fitness, that is, your reproductive success. And going to either extreme is not good either. And lastly, I'll say that what's the ideal phenotype, the ideal trait level, completely depends on the environment. So what's optimal, and i.e. being selected for in one environment, may be selected against in another environment.
Yeah, and on this theme, so we also hear a lot about nurture versus nature, and some people have taken the position that genetic differences don't matter at all. Say no, right?
Yeah, that's you can find reputable people on both sides. What we would call hereditarians on the genetic side, saying that it's all nature, and nurture, that is the environment, means nothing or is trivial. And then you have people on the other side saying that genes don't determine anything. They're all they do is build proteins that make a human being, and the rest is all the social environment and the physical environment, for that matter. It's nurture that determines who we are and who we become. And both of those extreme positions, like many extreme positions, are wrong based on what we know over the last 50 years. And in fact, there was a recent review article that looked at 50 years of studies, particularly twin-based studies, which we can discuss if you like, but had before sort of the genomics revolution, where we actually measure people's DNA like they do at Ancestry.com or 23andme.com. Twin-based analysis was kind of the workhorse or the mule of genetics research, particularly in behavioral sciences. And this recent review article looked at every study that's been done in the last 50 years and quantified the amount that was nature and the amount that was nurture. In other words, the genetic effect, or what's called the heritability, and the environmental influence. And literally, the median result was 49% genetic, 51% environmental. I mean, things like, included things like your triglyceride levels in your blood, that was actually much more genetic. Something like height is much more genetic in at least in rich countries. And then it had things like the big 5 personality traits, like neuroticism, openness, etc. And that was like much closer to 0. But on average, it was about half genetic and half environment, half nature, half nurture. So after all of these politicized debates, we come back to the conclusion that yes, genes and environment matter, and those of us working in my little corner of the world, what we call sociogenomics, are interested in how it's not just that genes matter and environment matters, but how they matter together, how each influence depends on each other, the other.
Yeah, yeah, and so let's go a little bit more into your corner of the world, the social genomics. So, how exactly, for a lay audience, how exactly do you go about figuring out the effect of genetic differences after controlling for social processes like racial discrimination or gender roles?
That's an excellent question. If I can kind of dodge it a little, I would say that I use genetics to answer social science questions. There is something unique about genetic data. I treat it like any other data source. But what's unique about genetics in the human sciences is that it's your genome, the letters of your DNA across your 23 pairs of chromosomes are determined at conception. Yes, there are some mutations over the course of life, but that's really, unless you're worried about cancer, that's a trivial concern from the point of view of a researcher like me. So it's set at conception. So we know everything that follows in the life course happened after you got your DNA ticket, if you will. So that helps us sort out some cause and effect in some ways. And then what's even nicer about it is that if you know the DNA sequences of the parents, then, or if you have siblings, then you can treat the DNA of the offspring as a random draw from the parents, or random differences between the siblings. And that's a really powerful tool to get at causal inference in the social sciences. We generally don't do experiments, although some sociologists do. We have to sort of infer what's going on in the world around us based on just observing data. I mean, we're kind of like astronomers in that regard, that we can't go out and do an experiment on a star. We can't really experiment on to know the effect of, say, marriage by randomly assigning a group of people to get married and other people not to get married. So I'll give you an example of how genetics helps us out here. So a recent paper that came out, written by a Princeton graduate student and myself, Romina Sotude in the department, we wanted to ask the question, how contagious, if you will, or what are the peer effects on smoking in American high schools? And one of the problems with peer effects literature is that if you smoke and I smoke and we're friends, like, how do I know that you influence me or I influence you? Like, first of all, that's called a reflection problem. We don't know who's actually convincing the other person to smoke or influencing the other person. Or it could be that we actually met, we were cutting class and we were hanging out in the bathroom smoking, and that's how we became friends. So actually, the birds of a feather flock together, or what we call homophily. So it's really a difficult, it seems like a simple question. How do friends influence each other on a behavior like smoking? And it's really difficult to disentangle because of all the possible causal arrows going on there. Well, we, quote unquote, solved that problem, or tried to solve the problem by using genetics. So what we did was, first of all, instead of looking at who people said their friends were, we looked at the entire grade. So you don't pick your grade grades, conditional on what school you're in. So there we solve the problem of the birds of a feather flock together. But we still have the problem of who's affecting whom. And there the genetics come in. So we use, instead of actual smoking behavior, we use people's, what we call a polygenic score. It's a sum total across their entire genome of the genetic likelihood or propensity to smoke. And what we found was that, so we know that you're not affecting my genes, and my gene, I'm not affecting your genes. So if we see an effect of Fred's genes on Dalton's smoking behavior, we know it's going that direction. So that's what we did, and we found that indeed the more people that are genetically likely to smoke in your grade, the more likely you are, net of your own genetics. And moreover, we found that what really matters is the distribution. Like if you have a few people who are really genetically kind of pre-programmed, if you will, but we don't use the term program, have a high likelihood of smoking based on their genes, and those genes are really involved in how your brain processes nicotine, then they kind of causes a contagion in the entire brain. Like a few people with extreme values will actually influence the whole brain. So, what we're really studying there is social contagion of smoking. But we're just using the genes as an instrument, if you will, in the laboratory to do that. I'll give you another example that's more related to race. So there's been a lot of research that shows there's skin tone, there's discrimination within the African American community based on skin tone, and that is in fact translated to health outcomes. So African Americans with darker skin tend to have higher rates of hypertension, high blood pressure, than African Americans of lighter skin tone. That's been shown in Brazil, in the United States, and I'm sure in other contexts. But mostly what those studies do is basically correlate someone's skin tone with their blood pressure and show, look, oh, there's a correlation here. They may control for a few things like age, for example. But you can come up with stories that it's not discrimination based on skin tone, that maybe it's where you're living, because African Americans in the South tend to have darker skin, for example, than African Americans in other regions in the country, and the South, for all groups, whites, blacks, and other groups, has a diet that's known to cause hypertension and obesity compared to other regions, comparatively. I'm just talking in relative terms here. So it could be that it's really place of residence, state of residence of driving this link between skin tone and hypertension. And you could factor out, you could look within region or whatever, but you can start coming with more and more stories that say, well, what about this, what about that? Well, what we did was we used siblings, and siblings who, because of the random draw of genetics, were different in their skin tone. And we found that the African American brother or sister with darker skin was more likely to have a higher blood pressure than the African American sibling with lighter skin. You could still say, wait, what if the genetics of skin tone also affect the cardiovascular system? One thing we know about genetics is that genes are workhorses. They're doing many jobs across the body. So it's very possible that the alleles, as we call them, that affect skin tone are also affecting directly your, let's say, the elasticity of your arteries that cause high blood pressure. So we test that directly. We take those alleles, but in a population which in this case is Americans of exclusively European descent, and we see that there's no relationship between those genes and hypertension in that population. So we rule out, as best as we can, this idea that it is what is called genetic pleiotropy between two traits, and then we conclude, and all conclusions in science are tentative, but we conclude that the relationship that's been documented between hypertension and skin tone is really due to a social process of discrimination or stress of being induced to a greater degree for darker skinned individuals. And we think we move the ball closer to the end zone, if you allow my metaphor, by doing that kind of stricter test, using the siblings, using the genetics, to show that there's real health effects of skin tone discrimination.
Wow. Which brings me to this question of our current moment, COVID-19. And so throughout the press, we're seeing discussions of disparities in health by race. Some people are talking about maybe it's something genetic that's driving the disproportionate number of Blacks and Latinx folks hospitalized or dying from the disease. And so what do we need to know about race and genetics to either affirm or rule out that conclusion?
That's a really good question. I mean, we know that there's so many factors that are causing disparities. There's, of course, if you get sick, there's disparities in healthcare, and I could talk about other examples of that, but I know we don't have a lot of time, and how we prove, quote unquote, prove those. There's disparities in the likelihood of getting COVID-19 based on your occupation and your exposure, if you're a frontline worker or not. There's disparities in other underlying risk factors and so forth. So how do you sort out, I guess, genetics from all of that? Well, when we talk about genetics, we have to talk about two things. One is, there's genetics like the ACE2 receptor in the lungs that seems to be the entry point for the virus. There might be variation across within populations on that, how many receptors you express, et cetera, whether or not they bind well to the virus. There's something like as basic as that. Then there's genetic influences on behavior. So how people behave and end up getting sick or not getting sick might be genetically influenced. I mean, as I mentioned at the outset, everything seems to have some degree of genetic component and some degree of environmental component. Then the trouble is when you try to then go to explain group differences, it's a next to impossible question to answer. And the reason is because the moment you're talking about a group, I mean, there's a bunch of reasons, but I'll start with the moment you're talking about a group, then you basically cannot disentangle genes from the environment. In the sense of, if I talk about anything, an ethnic group like Irish Americans, let's say, then they do have a shared genetic signature. There are different ancestral groups. There's a lot of mixing in the United States. We're a highly admixed population. It's called admixed population genetics because we're an immigrant society. And the original peoples that were here have also mixed in those that were not killed off by violence or disease. But everybody else has basically come and mixed. So yet you can detect signatures of different ancestry, what we call continental ancestries, or even subcontinental ancestries in someone's DNA. And the truth is, it's pretty accurate. In other words, if I got 100 samples from a representative cross section of the United States, that would mean that about 12 would be African American, about 13 or 14 would be of Latinx origin, and et cetera, et cetera. A geneticist would probably do pretty well, blinded to people's actual self-report, would do pretty well at putting people's DNA samples into the right social buckets, because we understand a lot about the sort of specific ancestral origins of different groups. For example, we know that the typical African American, the mean African American, is about 11 to 15% of European descent, usually about 1 to 2% Native American descent, and the rest being African descent. And those are signatures that can be seen in the DNA, and people obviously vary to that the amounts. But the moment we talk about a group, how do we disentangle the shared history, the shared lived experience, i.e. the environment, from that ancestry? It's next to impossible, because going back to the example of Irish Americans, you can identify those people in the buckets and put them in the Irish American bucket, or the whatever percent Irish American. But then you're also saying, well, they probably came over in the late 19th century or early 20th century. They probably came over in response to the potato famine in Ireland. They probably experienced discrimination over grandparents. We're talking about now, experienced discrimination in the early 20th century, and then they have certain cultural traditions they've passed on. So we can never know whether it's the effect of genetic ancestry, or the biological or genetic fact, or was it the social fact of being Irish? There is, in theory, a way you could do it, and I mentioned this in the chapter 5 of the Genome Factor, which is because we are all mixed up and we all have different amounts of chunks of the chromosomes from our parents, it can be the case that two brothers or two sisters, or brother and sister, actually differ in their ancestral components. So, for example, I am half Ashkenazi Jewish, which is a very clear ancestral signature in DNA. My kids range in what proportion. On average, they should be 25%, but they actually range in the proportion of Jewish ancestry that they have because of the random draw that they get. So you could compare siblings that have different amounts of this ancestral group and see how they turn out. Even that becomes complicated. So let's take the case of African Americans and discrimination again. You found some effect on health or on any outcome that you wanted by comparing siblings, and you found that ones that had more European ancestry had better health than ones that had less European and more African ancestry. Well, going back to the study I just talked about, yes, it's genetic in some sense, but what's the mechanism? Maybe the mechanism is that when you have more African ancestry, you tend to have darker skin, and that's leading to more social stress because of discrimination in society. So again, one of the things that we have to realize is that genes and the environments that we find ourselves in are not independent. Usually, we get treated a certain way based on our genetics, and that can in some cases make the genetics essentially come to fruition or come to fruition in a certain way. So even if we find some genetic effect, the mechanism that it has its effect, that genes have its effect, and that those genes could be really correlated with different ancestries or not correlated with different ancestries. It doesn't matter, but genetic effects can work entirely through the social environment of a particular society in a particular moment. And so even if we find that there's some genetic effect on susceptibility to getting COVID, and maybe it's behavioral, and maybe those genetic differences do correlate across what we will call socially determined groups, it still doesn't tell you the mechanism. It could be that that the mechanism is entirely something that we don't think of as biological or as legitimate, because the mechanism is some sort of discriminatory response to how someone looks, for example, which of course is influenced by genetics.
Okay, makes sense. And then,
so I don't think I answered your question about COVID, because I don't think we're going to know that anytime soon. There might be some, if there's, well, gives me a chance to say one more thing, which is one thing we've found over the last 10 years is what's called polygenicity, that most traits are not determined by one gene or by even like a handful, a half dozen genes. They're determined by thousands of places on the genome, all with little teeny effects. If you're going to be taller, if you want to get taller, you have to turn on hundreds of switches in your gene. If one makes one shorter, you have to turn on hundreds of switches in the gene. That has a lot of implications for the promise of gene editing or the lack thereof, et cetera. But what it also means is that it's not easy to think, okay, we found the gene for X, and now we're going to develop a drug that replaces that gene or blocks that gene effect. Likewise, in COVID, it might be different, but it might be that there's 1,000 little effects on the genome of what makes you susceptible or at higher risk for more serious complications, or because it's something very specific about a virus, it could not fall into that paradigm. It could be that there are some major genetic differences that are easily identifiable, have big effects, and may or may not vary across or within populations very much.
Yeah, and so just to close this out, are there some ways that we can think about the social sciences and genetics as kind of helping us foster a more just and equitable society?
Well, that's also a very tough question, and I just find it fascinating that the politics of genetics is very trait specific.
Mm-hmm.
So if you think about height, nobody gets upset or happy to know that in a rich society, 90% of the variation in height is determined by genes, or 80 to 90%. You know, it's not a big deal. If you talk about sexual orientation as having a genetic basis, that is something that's championed on the left. The moment you talk about something like cognitive ability or educational attainment or anything class related like income as having a genetic component, that's embraced by the right. I just find it fascinating from just a social scientific point of view of what characteristics go into which bucket of whether it's seen by which group as acceptable or not acceptable to talk about genetic influences on that trait. One last thing is that I mentioned that I think because of the polygenic nature of most traits, the idea that we're going to go in and start like snipping here and snipping there and like changing who we are or babies are is a long way away, if ever. But a technology that's already here is starting to diffuse into society, and that's polygenic prediction. So I can, as I mentioned before, I can make a score for someone that's going to predict their height or predict their likelihood of getting Alzheimer's or predict their later educational attainment or their body mass index or any number of things. And some predict really well, pretty well, none predict really well. Some predict decently well, and some predict very poorly. But if you take something like height or BMI, which the predictive power is not bad, you could go in and you could, and there's now a company, a startup that does this, that contracts with fertility clinics and offers to screen your embryos and tell you, if you want the tallest baby, implant this embryo.
Wow.
Yeah, and you could imagine they could do it for IQ, they could do it for any number of traits. That's here now, that's being done. We have no public debate about that. Those polygenic scores can also be used by insurance companies, not health insurance, because the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act prevents use of genetic information for healthcare and for employment. But talk about life insurance, long-term care insurance, car insurance, any number of things, private school admissions. In addition to your SATs, maybe some institution's going to want to see your genes, like sperm and ova banks, dating sites, anything where we care about who we're selecting or being selected by. This could be used. It's kind of like Brave New World sci-fi, but it's here now. And so we did a survey of the American population to say, well, what do you think of this, essentially? And I was just blown away that people were generally pretty laissez-faire about it. They were like, that strong majorities thought it was okay to have fertility clinics, screen embryos based on their genes and offer that information to prospective parents. That that they were a little less comfortable with schools using them or insurance companies, but there were still majorities that were comfortable with it, despite this general abstract notion in society that people should not be judged by their genes. So stay tuned, because I think this is an emerging and important area of debate and public perception, and it's not been politicized yet. There's no partisan lines yet.
And stay tuned, we will. So thank you so much for this conversation. I always feel like I'm learning something new when I talk to you. So so it's just fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Fred.
All right.